thinking your way out of the feeling is quite literally the most useless thing to do. So I'd love you to speak about that, how thinking is like the last resort we should go to in these moments of anxiety. Welcome to the New Age Sage podcast, where you come to free your mind from all the things that keep you in suffering. Wherever you are watching or listening to this on, please subscribe, like, or leave a review. I would greatly appreciate it. Today's guest is Dr. Jud Brewer. Dr. Jud was my professor at Brown University, where he taught me how to measure mindfulness through neuroscience. A New York Times bestselling author of the book Unwinding Anxiety. His TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has been viewed over 11 million times. He is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also serves as an Associate Professor in Behavioral and Social Sciences at the School of Public Health and Psychiatry at the School of Medicine at Brown University. He is the Executive Medical Director of Behavioral Health at Sharecare, the digital health company helping people manage all their health in one place. Also, he is a research affiliate at MIT. That's quite a resume. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You will learn a lot about anxiety and what to do when you're encountering it. I hope you love it. I love you all. Where I wanted to start is I notice in myself and people this mass resistance to feeling the sensation of anxiety. We go straight to the head. We want to think our way out of it. We just don't want to feel it. We want to do anything but feel. I'd love for you to speak as to why we can't feel, why we hate feeling it at all costs.
This has an evolutionary origin where we've learned, and we're not the only creatures that do this, where if something's unpleasant, we need to make it go away. And that's a survival mechanism. So, from everything from instincts, where if we touch a hot stove, we automatically pull our hands away. That's a reflex. We don't even notice until afterwards. Like, wow, that was hot. But that actually translates into avoiding emotional pain as well. So physical pain and emotional pain have a huge amount of overlap in the brain. And so that same mechanism gets co-opted where our brain says, ooh, that's unpleasant, make it go away. It's called negative reinforcement. And Eric Kandel, actually a neuroscientist, got the Nobel Prize back in the year 2000, showing that this type of mechanism, both positive and negative reinforcement, are evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. Positive reinforcement's just if something's pleasant, we learn to want to make that continue, which goes back to, if we eat some food, our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, hey, remember what you ate and where you found it, so that we can get that nutrient. The negative reinforcement side of things is, if you see danger and you run away, you learn to avoid that danger. And anxiety can be felt as something pretty unpleasant. And so we get in the habit of trying to avoid it. We distract ourselves, we stress eat, we do all sorts of things to try to numb ourselves from that feeling of anxiety.
In your book, which is the point that was most amazing to me, was that you actually can't think your way out of it. That thinking your way out of the feeling is quite literally the most useless thing to do. So I'd love you to speak about that, how thinking is like the last resort we should go to in these moments of anxiety.
Yeah. In modern society, and this has been happening for probably since the age of enlightenment, we've strongly preferenced our thinking rational mind to our feeling bodies. There's even on the Parthenon, there's a relief, carved into it from hundreds of years ago, where, there's this rider on a horse, and the horse signifies our passions and the rider signifies our reasoning mind. And, which one's stronger? The horse is going to buck the rider anytime, which doesn't stop us from trying to, rely on our willpower, beat ourselves up when we feel like we don't have enough of it. Unfortunately, that's not how our brains work. So this trying to think our way out of anxiety is something that we learn to do societally everybody says, oh, just stop worrying, stop being stressed, relax, whatever. But that's not really how our brains work. It's really about the feeling body being much stronger than the thinking brain. So we really look for solutions in the wrong places.
How can we go about switching from thinking to feeling? What's the best way to go about that? Because as you said, everyone just loves thinking their way out of it, especially in this rational world where rationality is celebrated so much. Even you read most self-help books, it's just like use logic, use willpower, use all these things. So how can we actually stop listening to that nonsense and start going into the body and feeling it through?
Well, here we can tap into the power of our brains as well. And the way that works is that our brains will learn to do things based on how rewarding they are. So going back to how unpleasant anxiety is, if something's unpleasant, we're going to stop doing it. And here we can bring some awareness, bring some curiosity in, and kind of map out, what our habit loops are around trying to force ourselves to change, whether it's trying to force ourselves out of anxiety or any other unhealthy habit. We can just map it out. What habit am I stuck in? Am I stuck in a willpower of trying to, stop eating that extra piece of cake or trying to stop worrying or whatever? Once we see that we're in that, then we can ask a simple question. What am I getting from this? So that we can help our brains very, very clearly see how unrewarding it is. So with willpower, it inevitably fails. We can ask ourselves, well, what did I get last time I tried to force myself to not worry? And we've actually probably built up quite a bit of a database that gives us all the evidence that we need to see, well, it didn't work the last 100 times. So is it really worth trying that again? And that's where I think of this as becoming disenchanted with these old habits. And I say that as a starting point because until we're convinced, from a feeling perspective, and then our brain catches up and says, oh yeah, that didn't work, it's going to be hard to change any old habit. So that's the first step, is just asking ourselves, what did I get from this before? And if we do it again, we can pay careful attention and ask, what am I getting from this now?
That
That sets us up. Go ahead.
That disenchantment is so powerful. When people ask me, because I'm very disciplined, I get an ice bath every morning. I eat like a crazy man. I'm militant about everything. And people ask me, how do you do it? It's like, I think about and feel how I feel like not doing it. How I feel, eating the crappy food, not working out, and just that feeling of feeling, tired, grouchy, grumpy. It just feels my body so much less rewarding than the benefits I get from maybe doing things I don't want to do. That I did it intuitively, but that's been the most powerful vehicle in my personal change. So it's great to hear that that's actually the way that our bodies and brains should go about creating a change in habits.
Yeah. And you're highlighting not just the disenchantment piece, but giving our brains something better to do. So our brains are always looking for what I think of as a bigger, better offer, the BBO. And so if we see that eating crappy food doesn't feel good and we've become disenchanted with that, our brain is going to say, well, give me something better. We can start exploring, using that as an example. What's it feel like to eat clean, to eat healthy food? Well, you tell me. I can tell you from my own experience, it feels much better. And so if I can just remember those two things, what was it like the last time I ate crappy food versus the last time I ate healthy food, then my brain can make that decision for me, not from a rational, I should eat healthy food perspective, but from a feeling perspective. We feel into our body and ask, what was that like last time? And that wisdom, it becomes a no-brainer. Our body says, well, of course, it feels better. And the more we do that, the more we get into that healthy habit, the more that's going to solidify those behaviors as bigger, better offers. And it'll be easier and easier to the point where our brain says, why would I not do that? I'll give you a concrete example from my own life. I used to be addicted to eating gummy worms. I'm sure everybody's had some form of a gummy worm, gummy bear, gummy animal, gummy thing. Yeah. They kind of look like fishing lures to me. They have these strange colors and they have this sickly sweet taste. And, when I really started paying attention when I ate, because I would have to eat the whole bag, just get rid of it, because everyone would make me want the next one. They're designed to be addictive. And I started paying attention first to what I felt like afterwards, which wasn't, get this gut bomb and then not sleep well. And then, get these urges to eat more the next day. So I basically couldn't have them in my apartment. And then I started really paying attention as I was eating them. And I realized, wow, these actually don't taste that great. And they make me want more, which is that feeling of craving in itself doesn't feel great. So then I started comparing them to eating blueberries. And I have to say, for me, blueberries are the bomb. They're delicious. They don't make me crave more. And I don't overindulge on blueberries. So now we can have gummy worms in the house because I'm just completely not interested. I just remember what's it like when I eat them. Ugh, they don't taste that great. These petroleum product type things. And then I my natural go-to is things like blueberries.
The similar process for me. What I'm curious about is I notice in habits when we enter a low state of being, a depressive or low energy, when we're at our most vulnerable, worst state, we often crawl back to the gummy worms or things. I was curious, what do you do in those moments? Let's say, for example, I think one thing that most men struggle with is porn addiction, and they often, always relapse and go back. For those people, let's say they've been off it for a month and they have a lonely night, they're sad, they're tired, they're angry. In those moments, what's the best thing to do when you're the most vulnerable to make sure you don't go back to that habit?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is not to try to force ourselves, because that force, it just gets us in the habit of, trying to force things and then beating ourselves up for, our willpower failure. So here I would say the first thing that somebody can do is just recall the last time they went back to it, let's say relapsed. And they can just, how rewarding was this last time? Right. And they can, I think of this as drawing from their disenchantment data bank. If they've built up all that interest in terms of disenchantment where, wow, this just really isn't helpful for me, then they can draw on that and they draw a little interest on that and say, well, what did I get from this last time? How did it really feel afterwards? And if they haven't built up that disenchantment, then they just, then I would say just pay attention as they go through the process. It's like, is this objectification of people, watching porn, all the things that paying attention to everything, not just the pleasurable elements of it. And then also how much, what happens afterwards. So how long the boredom qualities last, and then all the stuff that comes afterwards, the shame, the guilt, et cetera. Then they can compare that to, they can build up their database more in those moments to really, see, wow, how rewarding was that? And then they can compare that to more wholesome sexual activity.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of doing it. And you're talking about a much more somatic experience, less intellectual. And on that note, I think it's popular for men now. There's this whole alpha male movement of men self-shaming, or anyone self-shaming, where it's like the way to create change, like shaming yourself to go into the gym, shaming yourself to losing weight. It's the most popular vehicle for self-help, and people think it's effective. I was curious to see, I know you probably believe it's ineffective, but I'd love for you to speak onto that because it's such a popular thing. We all love to do it. And so, yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, Tide Pod challenges were also popular, and I wouldn't recommend those, so there are a lot of things that are popular, especially on the internet, that are just seem ridiculous. And I would say shaming ourselves is another one of those societally accepted and acceptable and almost, like heroic, like, oh yeah, just shame yourself to do this. From a neuroscientific standpoint, our brains are not that excited to get in those habits. It just doesn't feel good to shame ourselves. And theoretically, the whole point of shaming ourselves to do something is because it feels bad enough, we're going to do the thing that doesn't feel bad. It's like hitting ourselves with a stick to do something. Well, here I would say carrots are much more uh, effective than sticks are. And whether in the neuroscience shows this all the time. The idea here is that if we can find something that's actually rewarding that will draw us to the gym, then that's going to be more effective long term because carrots feel better than beating ourselves up. So here, I think you even described this from your own experience, is we can remember what's it like the last time I worked out. Feels pretty darn good. Is that going to naturally draw me to the gym in a more consistent and effective manner than shaming myself? Because we shame ourselves and it doesn't work, then there's even more shame piled on shame.
Yep. And hearing you talk about this, and I also picked it up in the book, which is an amazing book, by the way, is you have this kind of playfulness to your awareness that when you catch yourself maybe doing something that doesn't serve you as well, or you're changing a habit, what I see you recommend and talk about is a playful awareness, like a loving, kind playfulness to your own habit changes, which is a very unique way of going about it. I think none of us do, because we're all stuck in that shaming and being mean to ourselves. So why is it effective? Why is being playful with yourself around helping yourself such an effective way to create change?
Well, here we can just compare. What does it feel like to be playful? What's it feel like to be curious as compared to, shame or force or anything like that? It's a no-brainer for our brains. It just feels better to be playful. It feels better to be curious. Curiosity naturally draws us in. Oh, instead of that, oh no, that comes with like, I've got to do this, or like, I need to force this, or I'm going to beat myself up over this. So our brains have these natural mechanisms already designed, built right in that say, hey, curiosity feels better than force. So, follow that curiosity. It's going to get us to better places than force is.
Did you have a personal journey going from more of a hard way of speaking to yourself and self-shame to a more playful, loving? Did you have a personal experience in that journey?
I would say, a lot of my life, especially through high school, college, and I would say, it was really built around this, this willpower myth where I'm just going to force my way in through things. So, I have to say, I remember in medical school when I started meditating myself, I brought this willpower type approach to learning to meditate. And the idea was, if you pay attention to your breath and your mind wanders, just bring it back. And the instruction, which I couldn't hear because I wasn't in that mindset, was be playful, be curious. Like, oh, my mind's wandered, bring it back. It was like, oh, my mind's wandered, force it to come back and force that. And I'd go on week-long silent meditation retreats and I'd sweat through t-shirts in the middle of winter, trying to force myself to pay attention to my breath. On my first week-long retreat, I remember crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager, who I did not know at the time, because I was thinking, well, I can get into medical school, but I can't pay attention to my breath. So that's how much willpower was a failure for me. And I kept beating my head against the wall for probably close to 10 years as I was trying to learn to meditate, because that's all I knew, until I had this big breakthrough where I realized, wow, willpower's just not, it's not going to work. And curiosity is the way to go, and have not looked back since.
It makes a lot of sense. What I hear from that is kind of dropping an attachment of an expectation of the way, things should go. I think that's where people get messed up in meditation, is expecting themselves to be this master at coming back or attaching to like, oh, I can do this and escape these feelings, or I can do this and become a master of my mind. And what you're describing is just actually practicing the art of continually letting go, just being okay with whatever it is, whatever comes up, and not forcing any change, just being with curiosity, whatever exists in the system. And you touch upon that in the book, which I think was a great point, is kind of being observational versus fixing. Like if you have an anxious moment come up, or you're feeling a certain way, rather than going to the brain saying, how can I use XYZ to fix this issue? Instead going, oh, this thing's coming up. Let me observe the sensation, not attached to it, and just be with it as it floats.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of this as being rather than doing. In the societal habit, and many of our individual habits are just got to do more, do more, do more, do more. Well, really, that's about being more, being with our experience. And the image comes up. It's like water. We can try to force rocks out of the path, or we can be like water and flow around them. Which one's more natural, which one takes less energy, and which one's going to work, which one's going to be more effective. It's really about being with our experience, noticing when we're trying to force things, and letting go and letting things flow.
Yeah. The core philosophy of the Tao Te Ching is be while you do. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, how do you actually? I can sit and be while I watch crappy reality TV or stuff like that. What's tough for me or anyone, I think, is having that somatic feeling of being while in work situations, or how do you go about that being while doing?
Well, I think with everything we can use this internal sense of contraction versus expansion as a compass. So we could simply sit and watch crappy television and not pay attention to our internal experience and say, well, I'm just being here watching television. No, we're vegging out. So we can check to see whatever we're doing, in this moment, am I feeling more contracted or am I feeling more expanded? That can be a marker of where we're getting caught up in our experience and we're getting in our own way, that contraction feeling. It's like when we're trying to force things, that feels contracted. When we're getting caught up in a craving, it feels contracted. When we're getting caught up in anxiety and worrying, it feels contracted. And then we can compare that to being in the moment, being curious, like, oh, what are the circumstances that are contributing to this contraction? And that, helps us actually start moving in that opposite direction where we're starting to expand in that moment. And then we can ask, is this helping me live my best life? Is this helping, the world be a better place? And if it's not, then that's a moment where we can start to shift and change and ask, well, what would be more helpful? And we can explore that question and kind of live into that question rather than, just convincing ourselves that scrolling on our social media accounts is the best way to live our lives.
Yeah, it's crazy if you just look around. I genuinely believe that we love our anxiety. I don't mean that like literally, but if you look around, everyone's like this. We're all addicted to it. We're all like our egos, our unconscious minds love it. Like we love that shit anywhere. So it's fascinating. How do you wrap your head around that? Like, why do we as human beings love our anxiety so much? Again, not that we like sitting there being like, oh, I love this feeling. It's that we're addicted to it. Some part of us always wants to be in it no matter what.
Yeah, I would say there are two things there. One is that anxiety becomes a habit. And so the feeling of anxiety triggers us to do some behavior that keeps it around, like worrying. Worrying actually just feeds back and makes us more anxious, even though we feel like, well, at least I'm doing something, I'm worrying. But it hasn't been shown to actually be helpful for anxiety. It just makes it worse. The other thing that I would say there is that we are, as beings, we like habits. Habits help us survive, so we don't have to kind of relearn everything every day. And so when something is habitual, it's comfortable because it's telling our brain, hey, this isn't dangerous, at least not right now. Anxiety is not actually very good for our health long term, but our brains are not set up to think far into the future. They're set up for immediate survival. So if it's familiar, if it's comfortable, that signals, well, it hasn't killed me yet. And so we get stuck in those habit loops, whatever they are, simply because they're familiar, they're comfortable in that way. It's our comfort zone, even though anxiety is uncomfortable. There's the irony.
Yeah. What I think you're describing is leaving the comfort zone of anxiety. And what I think is dangerous in today's day and age is that when someone's anxious and they go to a psychiatrist, they get labeled as anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. When I talk to some of these people, I was once one of these people, and they put themselves in this box of, I have anxiety disorder. and then they like justify their constant anxiety by, I'll ask them, hey, what's going on? Why are you feeling this way? It's like, oh, I have anxiety. It's like they get stuck in this thing that they don't move out of it. So I was curious to see, how you feel about that, putting people in those boxes of like, oh, they're an anxious person. They're always going to feel anxiety and the harm that may do.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are two ways that people get put in those boxes. One is societally, get labeled. Psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, whatever says, oh, you're an anxious person. They're actually contributing to the problem, because that helps feed an identity that somebody might have. Oh, I'm an anxious person. I even had in our Unwinding Anxiety app, we put in a specific vignette of somebody who'd been pilot testing our program. This was years ago. This person wrote me an email before we had finalized our core modules and said, I feel like I've got anxiety that's deeply etched in my bones. That was so powerful that I actually put it as module 29, I think, in our program, because this highlights how strongly we can be identified with anxiety and how strongly we can be identified with anything, whether it's, oh, I'm a depressed person, addict, all these things where we label ourselves. And the reality is that we're people that get stuck in habit loops. So we can be stuck in a habit of being anxious. We can be stuck in a habit of some type of an addiction. We can even be stuck in the habit of having a really, down mood when we're depressed. So, and we're adding that negative thinking on top of it. Oh, this is never going to change. All of that, is really, if we look at it and get curious, these are patterns that our minds get stuck in that actually keep us stuck. And so the first thing to recognize is, oh, I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my feelings. I'm not my body sensations. These things come and go, which can be tremendously liberating in itself. And then we can go from there and start to map out these habits. And then, start to realize, we are beings that have thoughts, have emotions, and that we don't have to be identified with them.
Yeah, so powerful, man. So true. I'm one of those cases where from a young age, I was diagnosed bipolar, I was diagnosed ADHD, diagnosed God knows what all the time. And I put myself in those boxes that when I was down or feeling down, I'd say, oh, I'm depressed, I'm having an episode, and then had this whole thing would manifest. Whereas now I just like, in this moment, I feel the sensation of X. I try to remove the I, but like I just say the sensation of sadness. I just stay with it, and then it passes, and then I'm back to normal. And just that I wish people would just start thinking that way of don't be in this box. You can put yourself in a moment of feeling something that then passes. It's such a different way of going about things. And on that note, I'm trying to bring in the topic of medication, because that was also tied to my anxiety. So a couple years ago, I was diagnosed panic disorder. I was given benzos, and they'd tell me, hey, take this pill whenever you're anxious. And what ended up happening, of course, was I associated feeling anxious with needing a pill. And then I became resistant to it. I didn't want to feel it. So I was curious to see your perspective on the danger of, benzos and prescribing anxiety medications right away.
So generally speaking, as a psychiatrist, I prescribe medications. I tend not to prescribe benzodiazepines for anxiety, and they're actually not recommended as first-line treatment. Back in the day, in the 50s or whatever, everybody was taking the Rolling Stones. Mother's Little Helper was I think it was Valium, with benzos. So they were the rage, and then people started realizing, wow, these are not actually helpful, and they can be addictive. So feel anxious, take pill. Feel anxious, take pill. Rinse and repeat. Right? Not a good way to live. And basically, it's about numbing ourselves from life. So I recommend, and for the top line treatments, for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, about 1 in 5 people benefit from taking medication. So for some people, these can be really helpful. About 20% of folks. We are not great at predicting who those people are going to be. So, if somebody comes to me with severe anxiety and they want to try medication, the risk to benefit ratio. I'll determine, figure out whether it makes sense, and then maybe try medication. Some people can benefit from those types of medications. I would not recommend benzos, but try other things. And I would say everyone can benefit from understanding how their minds work and working with their minds. So this is where we developed this Unwinding Anxiety app to help people. Anybody with a smartphone can use this. And we did a randomized controlled trial where we got a 67% reduction in anxiety. That translated so that that 1 in 5 number is called the number needed to treat. How many people you need to treat before one person benefits? With medications, that's 5.2. That's where that 20% comes in. With the study that we did, that number was 1.6. So that just highlights how helpful it is for everyone to understand and learn how their minds work, so they can learn to work with their minds.
Since prescribing those kinds of medications right away without any investigation as to why that's the case, just investigating how it's a habit or what's causing it is so dangerous, do you have any ideas of how we can, but how the system can change, how you can start implementing maybe in a psychiatrist's handbook saying, hey, try mindfulness? I'm sure you thought about that. What's your opinion on how we can go about creating that change in the system? Because it's so rigid and stuck in this automatic prescription of medication.
Yeah. So there are a number of factors that contribute. And one of them is just habit. People are in the habit of doing things. So we have to be able to step out of our habits. And from a medical standpoint, it's really about finding evidence-based treatments. So we've done, several studies, for example, with our Unwinding Anxiety app, and have found, positive benefits. It takes a long time for a system to change even when there's strong evidence for something that's helpful and has, generally a low side effect profile. So just that inertia, I think on average, it takes about 17 years for a new treatment to kind of filter into the mainstream, reimbursement system. So, just from a logistics standpoint, it takes a long time for things to change. Now, it doesn't have to be the case where individual doctors and therapists and folks that are helping folks who are struggling with anxiety can be looking at the evidence themselves. They can be determining, wow, is this worth trying with my patients or my clients? And then trying, doing the experiments themselves, like seeing, is this going to help my patients? So, for example, I had a primary care physician, internal medicine doc, contact me randomly, who had said, she'd offered one of her patients selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor and our Unwinding Anxiety app, and followed up with him 3 weeks later. And he told her, he said, well, I didn't try the medication because I wasn't that excited to go on a medication, but I tried the app, and his anxiety had dropped significantly just within 3 weeks. And so she contacted me because she said, wow, I'm prescribing this to my patients all the time because it's as cheap as medication and it's more effective. So, for a lot of folks, something like a digital therapeutic may be a way to go. And I would say in general, we're going to see more digital therapeutics come online as the evidence develops. Yet that can take years to do the clinical studies and to do good clinical studies. So, we've done 3 with our Unwinding Anxiety app and have had very positive results. And, the hope is that people can start to see, as that evidence builds, there are other alternatives out there besides medications. Or I would also say, in addition to medications, it's not that, the two can't coexist.
Yeah, that's powerful. I'm very happy to hear you're doing that because, I had tough experiences with it, and it has to change, especially for people who, again, get the prescription so fast and they change their neurochemistry so quickly for no reason really. And we need to start, investigating, habits, how you're eating. And I'm not saying it's to shame anyone or anything who takes medication at all. It's just from the heart and the place of love, being like, investigate mindfulness, food, all this stuff as you do this stuff, because it's not as simple as just, handing someone something and calling it a day. There's still a lot of stuff that has to go into it. Moving on now to something else, I think one of the main points you made in the book that helps me with a lot of stuff is remembering that anxiety is truly useless. That we think in the moment, like, we get stuck to it, like, this is gonna help me work better. I'm feeling more alive. Everything's gonna work better, but it's utterly useless. It does nothing. So I'm curious to hear you speak of that, like why anxiety is useless in our way of going about things, and how we actually get used to believing that, how we can integrate that into our belief system that, hey, this isn't going to help me at all.
Mm-hmm. The best I can tell is that anxiety is this evolutionary hiccup where there are two helpful survival mechanisms that have kind of gotten mushed together to make something that's unhelpful. And so those two are fear. We learn from fear. You step out in the street because you're looking at your phone instead of looking both ways. And then you almost get hit by a car and you learn, oh, that was a bad idea. I should put my phone away when I'm walking down the street. So fear, helpful, very adaptive evolutionary mechanism. Also, we have planning. The more, this is more recent from an evolutionary perspective, planning for the future also helpful for obvious reasons. But when you bring those two together, fear of the future, right? Planning is all about the future. When fear of the future equals anxiety, especially worry, that doesn't help because we're not in immediate danger and we don't have to make immediate assessments based on what's actually happening. We're trying to spin out all these scenarios in our heads, and then we get locked into that, oh no, what if this happens? As compared to just planning, like, oh, this could happen, so I need to be prepared for that. Planning is very, very different than worrying. But that when you bring that fear element in, our brain tends to go offline and get stuck in those worst case scenarios. And that hasn't been shown to be adaptive at all. In fact, anxiety is not good for us.
Yeah, you often hear the counter argument to that being like, I need anxiety to work. I need it to do these things. And I was curious to see how, cause I'm assuming you worked from anxiety for a while in med school, all that kind of stuff. What was the process for you shifting away from using that as a fuel to work? Like, what is it now? Is it just pure presence? Like, how do you take someone who uses anxiety as fuel, loves the coffee, loves the green tea to push themselves through work? How do you move that to something else to work from a healthier place? And what is that place instead of anxiety?
Yeah, well, green tea is very different than anxiety.
Yeah, I mean more so like like using the feeling of like being turned on and to work all the time.
Yeah, so this is what's called the correlation fallacy, and this is perpetuated by the internet, unfortunately, and by people even writing books because they are so bought into the idea that anxiety is helpful. And I wrote about this in the Unwinding Anxiety book. There was a study back in 1908 where people are studying Japanese dancing mice, and they determined that a certain level of arousal, when they're awake, they're going to perform best. Duh. So if you're asleep or you're totally freaked out, that's that. When you're totally freaked out, you're going to freeze. And somebody extrapolated that in the 1950s, suggesting that this is what anxiety does. And then the internet ran with it in the year 2000. Like, nobody had cited this stuff. And then suddenly it exploded when the internet exploded because everybody's thinking, oh, this inverted U-shaped curve of anxiety, a little bit of anxiety is helpful. When you actually look at the research, it is not an inverted U-shaped curve. It is an inverse correlation. The more anxious somebody is, the worse they do. So the first thing we have to do is realize that correlation, if we're anxious and we get something done, doesn't mean that anxiety made that thing get done. That's the correlation does not equal causation. It didn't cause us to get something done. And then we can start looking, we're anxious all the time, then we're going to make that correlation all the time because we're thinking, oh, anxiety is what helped me get stuff done. Then we can look at the opposite. So the opposite of anxiety is flow. When we are in the moment that we're not even there, the definition of flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi described it as this effortless, selfless state and tremendously joyful. People describe flow as peak experience. And that's when we are just doing our best. So we can look at the opposite of anxiety and say, how does that work? Well, anxiety is not actually helping us. So then we can start to ask these questions like, is anxiety actually helping me? Or is this just my brain correlating anxiety with getting things done? So we can explore, well, what's it like when I'm not anxious? Am I more productive? Am I getting things done? And that's where we can help our brain see, oh, this is just a correlation. My brain, mistakenly put these two together. I don't need to be anxious to get things done. In fact, I can be more productive in a happier way and better for me, better for others around me. Anxiety is contagious. Nobody likes to be around people that are anxious. And we can really just step out of that process by seeing that that's just our brain. Our brains love to make correlations, and we just need to help our brains bust that myth.
Yep. Perfectly said. And also what I think about is if you're working in a state of anxiety or fear and you're consuming information and reading your book, let's go into this now, of how like your prefrontal cortex will have problems coming online if you're anxious or in a state of fear. I'm always curious, if you're learning stuff and you want to be able to think for yourself a little bit and say, maybe I should investigate this or that when you're in that state of fear or anxiety, you kind of just like download stuff. You don't really think about it. You're in this like autopilot hypnosis in a way where you just believe whatever you're told. I'm curious about if you thought about or studied how fear affects our consumption of information.
I haven't studied that. My lab hasn't studied that itself. I imagine, if you think of the far end of the spectrum of anxiety, panic, the definition is something like, this feeling of anxiety that's so extreme that it leads to wildly unthinking behavior. So this is where herd mentality comes in. So I would say with extreme fear, if you look at that far end of the spectrum, we are not thinking at all. Our prefrontal cortex is offline and we're just following what everybody else is doing, which can be a really dangerous thing for everyone involved.
Yeah, you see it now in today's day and age, and this herd mentality thinking, where just you have someone set a state of panic in everyone through something, and then they all believe whatever they're told to make that fear go away. And I think going off of that, what's important for people in my eyes, and if you agree, is tolerating the fear, tolerating not knowing something, and being okay in that space, being perfectly fine managing their ability to not know something, to be in a state of fear. I think it's a powerful way to go about your life.
Yes, I would say a lot of folks, they live in two zones: the comfort zone, where things are safe and comfortable and they're just doing their thing, which is also groupthink as well. It's like, oh, if people share the same beliefs, etc. This is where social media fell into this rabbit hole of realizing that if they kind of radicalize people to whatever topic, it doesn't even matter, but they're finding more, giving people content that feels familiar and more familiar. They get more clicks. They get them to stay on their social media sites more. So this is that comfort zone is where we often live, and if we're not even aware that can happen, we get sucked into those things where it's our in-group mentality. So there's that comfort zone, and then there's the panic zone. So when somebody says run, especially if it's on our in-group, everybody runs. So neither of those are particularly aware states, because we're kind of in our habit of being comfortable, and then in our panic zone of just running. So the idea is, can we actually bring curiosity in first to understand these and learn, oh, I'm here or here, and then find that there's actually a zone in the middle called the growth zone. So instead of going, oh no, this is different than what I know, and we don't go there because it's not comfortable, or we are in the freak out, oh no, this is terrible, we can go, oh, and we get curious. That opens us to explore what's actually happening right now, instead of doing that wildly unthinking behavior and panic, or the wildly let's say stuckness of being in our comfort zone. And then we can start to learn, oh, growth zone, it's called the growth zone for a reason, is where I learn and grow. And it actually feels pretty good when we can learn to be comfortable with discomfort, because that discomfort is just saying, hey, this is different. Certainly need to check to make sure that it's safe, because that's our survival brain saying, hey, this is different, and you make sure it's safe. And when we realize that, oh, this is just different, we can lean into that different and see, wow, I actually grow more. This actually feels okay. That something is different instead of being locked in either of these other extremes.
Yeah, it's a very powerful way of thinking, of always relating things back to growth. But on that note, if anyone moves from their comfort zone to growth, there's a mass period of resistance where you hear, for example, I love the ice bath in the morning because I do it every morning. I've done it for, I think, half a year now. And every morning when I'm doing it, my brain's like, don't do it today. You did it yesterday. Take a hot shower. You deserve it. That no matter what, my comfort zone will start yapping at me, no matter what. And then the feelings of that comfort zone will come up. So it's, what do you recommend to people in that moment of in that transition where their body and their thoughts are doing everything they possibly can to pull you away from that growth zone? So it's how it worked for me, and I think many people, where the more you get close to that zone of growth, the more the comfort zone will scream at you, come back, come back, come back, come back. So how do you recommend for people to keep pushing forward, keep trucking, and not listen to that voice?
So the first thing to do is to just recognize resistance. What does resistance feel like? And what do we get from resistance? We can ask ourselves, well, when I resist something, what do I get from this? And then we can remember, well, what was the last time like when I was in my growth zone, and really feel into that experience. Being in our growth zone can feel pretty good. And then we can ask ourselves, which do I prefer? Let our brains decide for us.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, again, you're whenever I hear it in your voice, it's always this self-kindness, this self-compassion. And a point you make in the book is that kindness actually helps anxiety. But when you're anxious, the last thing you want to do is be kind. You kind of want to be this, you want to make people feel the way you feel. That's, I think, the golden rule of life. If you're anxious and stressed out, you want to project that stress and anxiety to other people. So I'm curious to see, how kindness itself, as being a kind person and being kind to people, not just yourself, but being kind to others, can actually help your anxiety in the long run.
Well, this is something we can all explore ourselves. We can do that experiment. We can compare spreading kindness to spreading anxiety and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So I asked my followers just how they felt about their anxiety, what was going on. And the number one thing I got back was racing thoughts at night. Almost every single time it was someone saying racing thoughts at night. So two things. Why is that so common? Why, when we're in our state of just going to sleep, why does all this stuff start coming up? And how can we move past that habit? Because it is really destructive, because it destroys our sleep, which then causes more anxiety the next day.
Yeah. So one speculation is that when we distract ourselves or keep ourselves busy during the day, when we're going to sleep, our brains say, my turn, and they say, okay, you're not doing anything right now. You're supposed to be going to sleep. So I'm going to start thinking about all the things I need to do tomorrow. And then we start worrying. Oh no, I can't get to sleep, because worry and anxiety are actually arousing. It makes it harder to get to sleep. So then we look at the clock or our phone or whatever and realize, oh man, it's been an hour. In my mind, I'm not anywhere near sleep. And so we get more worried, more anxious, and it just spirals out of control. I see this all the time in my clinic as well. So here we can start to learn, okay, here's my brain getting stuck in this anxiety and worry habit loop. And there are ways to step out of it. So for example, we even did a clinical trial with sleep where we found that just helping people map out and work with their anxiety habit loops using our own running anxiety app, I reduced anxiety and helped people, get better quality sleep.
Awesome. Do you recommend any in that? Let's say you're in that state of high arousal, your thoughts are moving. You recommend meditation as a way to pull yourself out of it. Is there any specific technique or breathing exercise that you would recommend for people to return to a state of, intellectual homeostasis where they feel safe and secure? Is there the quick hack to return to feeling good in some kind of breathing state?
Yeah, the one that I've found most effective over the years, and there, really folks have to try out what works best for them. It's called the body scan. I even put a YouTube video up on my YouTube channel just to help people, guide people through it. But I would say that's where I tend to recommend people to start, regardless of how much they've meditated in the past or not. It's a pretty straightforward process.
How long would you think it takes the average person to be able to be skilled at pulling themselves out of anxiety through breathing? Because I think what stops people is this expectation of, I should be doing it immediately. This should be happening now. I can't get out of it. How long? I mean, it's not one size fits all, but it must take a while to get to a place where you can truly, bring yourself back to normal through breathing.
Yeah, and I wouldn't. So I can't answer just specifically through breathing itself, because that's a pretty. That's
Yeah,
one.
I mean, more so like the in that moment of like how long someone can through time come back to a state of
So there's a tool that we have in our Unrunning Anxiety app called 5-finger breathing, and I'll also have a YouTube video that explains it and the neuroscience behind it, which is basically within 5 breaths, someone can really ground themselves using a practice like 5-finger breathing. That one in particular brings in multimodal, multi-senses as a way to really help that rapid grounding and helping our working memory part of our brain kind of reboot. So it can happen, within 5 breaths.
wow, that's quick. One last topic before we wrap up I wanted to bring up is, I think in this process of helping our anxiety, of healing from our anxiety, in today's day and age, we get very good at, if you go to therapy or any of that kind of stuff, you go back to the patterns, right? Like, this happened to me as a kid, and the trauma, which is useful, I think, to get to know yourself. But at what point does it become detrimental to just, whenever you're feeling that way, to go back to the trauma, go back to the point of origin, versus just seeing it as a habit and starting to disenchant yourself?
Well, I would say, for folks that have a trauma history, it's really, important to honor that and to, get support around that. So generally speaking, if you look at the behavior change formulas for, in neuroscience, history is important in terms of setting up the reward value of a certain behavior. And then it's really about that reward value and in the moment. So the history is not as important when a habit has been established. So for example, there was somebody in our Unwinding Anxiety program who talked about he had some childhood trauma. This is a guy probably in his 60s now, maybe even older. And he would worry as a way to make him feel in control, because as a kid, he had no control over a situation. And he carried that worry forward for decades and decades and decades. And that was his coping mechanism that he finally mapped out and realized, oh, this isn't actually helping me now in my 60s or 70s. And he had to he described it as honoring that, childhood coping mechanism, and not just saying, oh, that was dumb. But that was really, this is all I had. This is what I've carried forward, and now I can let it go. So it's really, about honoring whatever was helpful for us, and then seeing if that shoe still fits, and really paying attention. And for him, that shoe didn't fit anymore, which then opens up the door to move to things that are helpful in this moment. And so that's really about habit change in the moment.
You're speaking to something definitely on the collective mind. What I see is we're falling in love with the awareness, which is good, right? Everyone's taking psychedelics, everyone's taking the mushrooms, all that kind of stuff that brings up awareness of what exists, but then actually creating change and moving in towards the position where you can change your mind and body is where people get stuck on it. Do you ever see that, where people finally become aware and they're like, whoa, I finally know all this stuff, but then they get stuck in actually creating change?
Yes. So it's both are important to know that change is possible and what it feels like to expand. That's why shrooms are described as mind expanding drugs, right? Because it helps us see, oh, this is possible, where we might not have known that it's possible. Yet we've got to train our minds to be able to move in that direction. So it's not just seeing, okay, and then not knowing how to work with that, but it's really about seeing what's possible and then knowing that we can actually train ourselves to move in that direction. So that, that's where the compass of contraction versus expansion can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, where I use the historical reflection of what happened for me is that I allow it to trigger kindness. That when I think about, all I don't focus on is I think about, oh, this is stemming from me as a kid when I didn't get XYZ, and feeling that younger self and have my heart expand and being kind to that kid. For me, I quickly use it as a vehicle to open my heart, to open kindness, to then go, okay, let's take care of this, let's do this. And that like opening, rather than, as you say, like shame, oh, why'd I do that, why'd I do this, that you contract, versus using that to be like, okay, it's okay, I forgive myself, I love my younger self, it's okay. Now let me actually change this and create change from that one time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap up here. Thank you so much for coming on. I learned a lot, and I hope people who are watching learned a lot. If you want to shout out any of your pages or people can find you, please do so.
The easiest way to find me is my Dr. Jud website, drjud.com. I also have a Dr. Jud YouTube channel. I mentioned several meditations and practices that folks can check out there as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. Thank you. Have a good one. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to watch more content, click this video right here. And please don't forget to subscribe right here. Thank you.